Hello, I am Suzanne Hilster-Wiles, President of GGNA, and I am delighted to welcome you to the latest edition of our Thought Leadership Series. If you have questions during today's presentation, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom or top of your screen. We won't have time to answer them during this webinar today, but we'll post answers on our website following. I am joined today by my former colleague and friend, Andy Shanlin. A leader in the field, Andy oversees alumni engagement at his alma mater, Brown University, and has led his team in thinking about creative solutions to engaging alumni during this time. I had the opportunity to see Andy's innovative and thoughtful work in alumni engagement up close in several client engagements with which we worked together. When we worked in particular at Aalto University in Finland, and Andy and I had an exchange on LinkedIn about this. We were in Finland together for several days, staying at a hotel on the outskirts of campus, which featured elk prominently in its hotel restaurant. Andy is a vegetarian. I eat very little meat. So Andy introduced me to now one of my favorite travel meals, the Andy on the road, which is just salad french fries. This is just one of the many wonderful ideas I've gotten from Andy through the ages, and I'm so happy that he's here with us today. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Suzanne. I remember our work together fondly, and it's a pleasure to be back with GGNA today for the webinar. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So Andy, could you start out by telling us about the Alumni Engagement Program at Brown?
Yes, so Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island is a top tier research university with a strong liberal arts and a humanities tradition. We have an unusual undergraduate curriculum that gives each student a lot of control over their own specific academic path. We've got about 10,000 students, of which 70% are undergraduates, and we have a medical school with about 600 students. And worldwide, we have about 100,000 alumni living worldwide from all our programs. So I'm very lucky that I'm at an institution that has a long history of investing in alumni engagement. Brown's more than 250 years old, and the alumni office goes back, or the alumni program of different kinds, the association goes back to the first half of the 19th century. So there's a lot of history and tradition of alumni involvement. My office is the central alumni team for the university, and we have about 24 staff members. And the Alumni Association, which I mentioned a moment ago, is led by a volunteer board that has about 20 or so volunteers. And alumni, though, are involved in a pretty wide variety of volunteer roles, especially leadership roles. We have more than 100 regional alumni clubs around the world in various cities. We've got obviously our graduating class years because we have a class year based undergraduate reunion program that's quite strong. This is my reunion year. I'm class of '86. And we have alumni who serve special interest groups, racial or ethnic or other identity-based affinity groups. We've got mentors. We have a strong women's network worldwide. We've got almost, I'd say we have about 20 advisory or leadership councils that are associated with various departments and institutes and centers. And all of those consist primarily of alumni volunteer members as well. And so the volunteer profile is very important to our alumni engagement model.
Thank you, Andy. I'm just struck by talking about 20 different councils. I was earlier today on a call with a client where they, understandably, but the head of advancement was talking about the time and challenge it takes to engage with volunteers. So I imagine that's a formidable part of your staff's charge.
It is, but the key to doing it, and this is a theme that may pop up later in our conversation, is partnership with other campus units. So each of these advisory councils, you know, there's one for the college, there's one for engineering, there's one for athletics, there's one for research institutes and research centers and so on. Each of them has a staff liaison who is a senior person in that part of the university, who's our partner in ensuring that the volunteers have meaningful work to do, that we get the right people around the table, and that we track their the outcomes of their work. So, we couldn't do it ourselves. It's definitely a partnership.
That's great. So, Andy, as we work with institutions, we often hear about the concept of lost classes, groups of alumni who were students during times of either societal or institutional disruption. So what are you doing now to work with the students who are going to be, graduating from an institution during a time when their student experience was greatly impacted?
Yeah, it's been a really highly disrupted year in North America, especially, I think, but around the world. Traditional lost classes, we tend to think in terms of alumni, we tend to think of alumni from the late 1960s or the early 1970s, whose time on campus was associated with social unrest and a lot of upheaval. And I have heard people comment that students whose final months of study were disrupted by COVID-19, and in fact, this year's graduating class, whose entire year was thrown off kilter by having to adapt to a virtual environment, might be adrift from the institution in much the same way. We don't know, obviously, if that will turn out to be true, but it's very clear that as new graduates, last year's graduating class and this year's new class of alumni are going to be in need of extra information, extra resources, and extra support as they navigate. One thing we've done that is turning out to be really helpful in that regard is the creation of a new staff role that we call Alumni Success Officer.
Mhm.
And this person is basically reaching out to the newest graduates when they graduate, saying two things, essentially. One, congratulations, that's a great achievement. You've earned your degree. And then two, what are you trying to do now? And would you like some help? They're basically asking what individuals, new alumni need, and then sharing with those alumni where the alumni network or the university itself can be of help. Most of the information that new graduates want tends to be focused on professional choices, career path, jobs, networking. And that's not new. That's always been true, but it's magnified now because of COVID's impact on the job market and so on. The difference in what we're doing with the Alumni Success Officer compared with, say, a traditional student alumni association or an alumni career services program is that we've consciously decided to take a more individualized approach. So there's no mass communication. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. The trade-off is that we can't say that we're reaching all of the new graduates, but we can say that the ones who we are engaging with are getting better attention, more service, greater support, more relevant resources than would be possible under any other model. And we're very conscious of not trying to duplicate something that alumni could do on their own, like, a course they could find on LinkedIn or just something to Google or see on YouTube. We really intentionally want to connect them with resources that are unique to Brown, that are more relevant to their needs, and therefore, hopefully, cement their supportive and loyal connection back to the university so that in the future, they aren't adrift and they don't have that kind of arm's length relationship with the university. They really feel like Brown has continued to support them even after they graduated. One other thing we've done that I think is addressing the sort of potential to lose our new alumni is to create a couple of working groups within the alumni team. I can say more about it later, but for now, I'll say that one of our two working groups that we've created among the alumni staff is, we just call it the network. And it's focused on how to make resources that are present in the alumni network globally as visible and as accessible to these new graduates as possible. So they're spotlighting and developing a small number of ways to ensure that all alumni, but especially those whose relationship might be affected by this past year's events, have the tools and the information that they need when they need it to stay connected and supported.
Great, thank you. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out for institutions into the future. So now shifting back to people who are already alumni, what things has your team added or changed in response to COVID this last year?
So I expect that some of the initiatives that these working groups are developing will turn out to be things that we keep long-term, that they're useful and they're appealing, even if we return to much more face-to-face interaction and so on. Some of the improvements are internal, and they're not necessarily going to be visible to alumni themselves. For example, we're looking at how to record and report certain data more effectively, use our alumni database more effectively, for example. So I would encourage people who are listening today to not just think about external programs or services, not just what's on the website or hosting more events, but also look at your internal workflow, your org chart, and your systems to make sure that you're updating things. With this shift a year ago to all of a sudden everything being completely online, we had to put some tools in the hands of the volunteers I was talking about a few minutes ago to help them. And I'm very proud because members of our team recently received gold recognition from the CASE District 1 Awards program for a specific offering we developed in response to COVID. And we call it the Volunteer Engagement Toolkit. It's basically an online resource that breaks down into really simple terms, even for people who are not experienced with online events or programming, ways to keep alumni under these various groups, clubs, classes, affinity groups, and so on, connected and informed, engaged, and aware of their relationship with the university. Even as they were canceling some pretty significant in-person events that had already been planned. Like obviously last spring, we didn't have spring reunions on campus, but the whole COVID thing, we went remote, I think it was like March 15th or something. It was less than 7 days away from our annual volunteer summit in New York City for hundreds of alumni. And we had to basically figure out in a few days what to do online. So the volunteer toolkit has been really useful as an online tool, and we're actually building it out further to focus on networking, as I said a few moments ago, access and visibility to alumni worldwide. We've had to, like every institution, become much more adept at the online meeting and event thing. So I think that a lot of our, going forward, in fact, I had a meeting about this morning, which is which of our things do we think we need to start thinking about always doing online, or these sort of hybrid events where we could have face-to-face activities, maybe with a live speaker for people who are on site, but make sure that there's an online component to engage people who can't or don't participate in person. I will say a lot of institutions are way further ahead than we are in this realm, because the thing about having a well-established, long-standing program, like I described at the top of our conversation, is that it's very traditional. So it is based, we had not done very much, frankly, with online engagement. And so we've had to get up to speed pretty fast. I will mention one last thing, which we've sort of pivoted to, which is this hyper focus I mentioned on our newest alumni is definitely new to us, and in that it's something that we've built out strategically, and now we're thinking about it long term. I mentioned the Alumni Success Officer position. That was initially funded for 1 year. The president's office supported the experiment in having this position, with the understanding that if it turned out to be successful, we would have to find funding for it and kind of continue it. And I'm happy to say that this month last month, we just found out that it is in fact now funded and approved by the institution for permanent staffing. And so it's great because it means we can continue to emphasize the student to alumni transition, even after we're back into an in-person mode. The programs I'm talking about are not really separate things. One thing we've learned is that everything overlaps. There's young alumni and career services. There's regional programs and online engagement. There's shared interest groups and affinity groups, mentoring and academic advising. So we're trying to be more intentional about exploring the intersections of all these and figuring out how it impacts our actual programming and the program content.
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned, and Andy, you and I talked about in preparation for this call, is the sort of unintended upside of this is with video technology and not offering access to people who are not in the neighborhood by putting a camera up in the back of the room and making them feel sort of less included somehow than more. Building real online programming has allowed institutions like Brown to engage a much broader swath of their population than they have. And in fact, people that they've wanted to engage for a long time are, are participating in things for the first time. I'd imagine that there are a lot of those tools you just talked about that you plan to continue post-COVID.
There are, and it has a sort of a knock-on effect that I'll mention because I know this is a hot topic in alumni engagement circles, which is metrics or measuring engagement. One of the things we just finished settling on a sort of a set of metrics, sort of standard engagement metrics that we were going to track, like around March 1st, a year ago. And then 2 weeks later, we had to deal with COVID, and we discovered that our metrics were all based, like I said, on our very traditional face-to-face engagement, where you actually know who attended the event, you know who was there, because at the end of the event, their name tag is missing. That means they came to the event, they picked it. When you go online, depending on their system and the registration and authentication and logins, you don't necessarily know who's participating, who watched, who stayed for the whole thing, who left early, who brought a friend. And so the metrics have changed. And so we're not as sure about the overall numbers or who's who, but we do know that anecdotally, at least for now, anecdotally, we are reaching people who appreciate that we've finally breached that sort of online environment and are adding that. We also did something that I think has appealed to new audiences, which is this year, it seemed like there was more public focus on fewer topics in general than in a normal year. So in a normal year, we'd try to have programming like speakers or panels or presentations that span the entire scope of everything the university does, which is vast. This year, we really narrowed it down and we sort of focused. I mentioned that content working group. Their focus has really been on sort of like, what are the 3 or 4 things that almost everybody needs to know Brown is involved in improving or developing or addressing? Obviously, public health and COVID, race relations, anti-Black violence in the United States, and discrimination of all types, social justice more broadly, and obviously the presidential election last fall and its aftermath now. These are areas where Brown researchers and teachers and students and alumni have things to say that are really important. And so we're narrowing our focus a little bit to make it a little bit more appealing and relevant to the average alum.
Thank you. I do want to apologize to our viewers. We have had some behind the scenes technical issues with Zoom. And you all, of course, were seeing our own internal working screen. And now we've got the other folks from the GGNA team also visible. So I think if there's one thing we've learned this year, even after 100 times of doing this, the fact that sometimes the technology doesn't work exactly as planned is also, so I think those of us who can be a little creative and on our feet probably do better. So apologies to you all for that. So Andy, I know that there are things that you suspended because of COVID that you would like to permanently get rid of. How do you do that? And what are those things, and how are you working with institutional leaders across across volunteers, academic leaders, to build buy-in for getting rid of those things?
Yeah, so you're right. There are some things that we're sort of now saying, that old saying, right? Never waste a crisis. It's a cliche, but if it gives you an opportunity to say, wow, we had to rethink what really matters, that's actually a good thing to do. And it's legit. It's not an excuse for getting rid of something. It helps you understand what do you really need and what don't you need. As far as your question, which is kind of making the case either with institutional leadership or with our volunteer leaders, it turns out that having a strategy, it turns out to be really useful. It's, again, sounds obvious, right? But as you know from your consulting work, things that seem like they should be obvious aren't always present in your institution. So a couple of years ago, when I have returned to Brown to take on this role, we compiled for our team from scratch a new kind of a roadmap for strategy. We set some key goals to help us meet our mission. One of those goals was partnership with other parts of the institution. So I mentioned this earlier in the call. It's easy over time to sort of stay on your organizational island. You got your budget, you got your org chart, you have your programs, and you just go and do your work. But to overcome that, we actually set an explicit goal of joining up with academic departments or research centers or institutes, and also administrative partners like Campus Life and the Career Center. And doing that sort of intentionally and making it an explicit goal has resulted in more communication and interaction, and better communication and interaction with folks around the institution. And so what happens is when you go and you talk to somebody about a program that you were doing jointly and that you now no longer are able to support, instead of just showing up and saying, hey, you don't know us, but we're canceling this thing you used to,
Right.
You're actually showing up and saying two things. One, you're saying, hey, it's me again. We've already been in conversation, and trust us.
Yeah.
And vice versa. And secondly, we have a strategy roadmap, and what we're doing in your area doesn't align with what we stated our goals were. So let's take a look at that, figure out if there's something else we could do together and why this may not make sense to pursue. So campus leaders, I think, know more about what our team does, what we're good at, why we're doing it, what happens when we do it. So they trust our judgment if it comes to something related to alumni. Just informing them what we're going to do isn't really effective. They need to kind of know our track record and trust us as professionals.
Yeah.
And having that roadmap means we're also not just jumping on the latest idea or the last suggestion we heard. We're evaluating things against a long-term set of intended outcomes.
Yeah.
On the volunteer side, alumni volunteers really obviously want to know, especially in a leadership role, that their work is meaningful. It's not just designed to keep them busy. And so you have to build trust with volunteers by listening to their input and, adopting their ideas where possible, because it makes sense for your strategy and because you have the resources. More informed volunteers are, the more they know about some of your internal workings, like the general landscape of finance and budgeting, what's going on with hiring and HR and staffing, what's the strategic planning process. The more they know about that, the more that their ideas will be ones that you actually can use and implement, and the less that you'll have to say thanks, but no thanks when they offer help or try to do something that improves your programming. The last thing I'd say is that it takes time to build a culture like what I'm describing. It's not automatic, and there are better examples of it than what we do at Brown. We're still sort of building it as we go. But I think we're improving our planning and the delivery of the opportunities, both in terms of our campus partnerships and in terms of our engagement of leadership volunteers. Having said all that, we know that if we cancel something the university's been doing for many years, even if we've got the best strategic justification in the world, I am certain to hear from alumni who feel that we've ignored their advice. This year we obviously can't do reunions in person in May, which is when we have reunions. And a lot of alumni are, they're all disappointed. Like I said, it's my reunion year too. I'm disappointed. But the point is that we intend to go back out and say, and here's what we are going to do. And hopefully we're doing things that are engaging enough to keep people interested, connected, and informed about what's going on at Brown, and keep them connected with each other so that the alumni community stays strong and that network is still there for other alumni.
Andy, you said something that I think is so important. I just want to reiterate it. The relationship between the staff and the volunteers is a partnership, and making sure that you're sharing the kind of information that will allow them to both understand the decisions you have to make, whether or not they're the decisions they think they would choose, but also so that the suggestions they give are just much more likely to be, able to be implemented, to be additive to what you're doing. I think I had a call with a client yesterday, in fact, where the client was frustrated because the group of volunteers had been handed a set of tasks and follow through was weak. But, as we talked about how those things, how they happened, how they were shared, the way in which they were shared, there was such a disconnect between the volunteer saying, I want to be helpful, and, receiving a to-do list. And too often we see that, and understandably staffs are short, they're short of time as well, but it results in very little meaningful work by the volunteers or for the volunteers.
Yeah, and I recommend for people on the call who maybe haven't done it, if you're not a volunteer yourself,
Yeah.
for some organization that you care about or a cause that you think is really worthwhile, I recommend that you take time to volunteer. I've served on a couple of boards, and it completely changed my understanding of the definition of engagement and meaningful. What counts, and that idea as staff members that we incorporate alumni in our conversations. We don't do everything they say, and we don't give them all of the inside details about what's happening, but enough so that they have ownership of the work product and the program outcomes. It's a balancing act. It's an art. It's not a science. But the more you do it, the better you get, and the more you set the example, so that alumni know what to expect as volunteers, and they're not overstepping bounds that you would like to set for them, and they're not underperforming in terms of follow through, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, I will. And I love your recommendation that people do volunteer work themselves. It is my experience on the Parents Leadership Annual Giving Council at my daughter's school that made me appreciate why deadlines are important, because I certainly was sending out my letters, an hour before that meeting where I had to report on what I had done. So
Yep.
we're all guilty of it. And I am
Yep.
very sympathetic to the volunteers who are doing that too, using that.
Absolutely.
So finally, you've shared with me during our previous conversation some great ideas from other institutions, and knowing that great ideas are meant to be stolen and adapted. Could you share a couple that you think are particularly innovative?
Yeah, I'll share a couple that I think have that partnership element to them that I was just talking about. And one of the great things about our profession, and I'm now, by the way, last week was my 32nd year in alumni relations.
Wow.
I
Congratulations.
thank you. But one of the things that I feel very lucky about is the fact that it's a profession that allows us to sort of learn from each other's examples, and that people are so willing to share info. I belong to Brown belongs to the Association of Private College and University Alumni Directors, PQUAD. And at a recent meeting, some of the alumni executives from those schools shared examples of programs that they've pivoted to or implemented in response to COVID. One example that's really interesting is at American University. Our friend Raina Lanny and her team have incorporated alumni directly into the educational experience of the students. So the alumni office works with academic affairs. They build alumni expertise intentionally into some courses that are at the heart of the undergraduate curriculum. So they're modeling alumni engagement for students, but they're also enriching the students' education by incorporating the experience of these incredibly accomplished alumni. I love that partnership.
Yeah.
The other one I would mention is Susan Cohen at Washington University in St. Louis. Has established a weekly online program featuring conversations with different faculty members, trustees, parents of current students, obviously alumni. And it showcases the expertise and the leadership that exists across a range of industries and sectors of society as represented by the university community. So in doing that, they increased the visibility of the Alumni Association at WashU. They also have engaged their chancellor, the campus leader, more directly in alumni programming. So they now have a champion who understands the impact of what the alumni team does at the highest level of the institution. And you just can't put enough value on that. I mean, that's incredibly important internally, as well as in terms of the impact it has on the people watching these programs who are now connected and informed about the university. So they're not the only ones doing this kinds of thing. There are tons of examples out there, but those are two that jumped out at me from colleagues whose programs I was thinking about. Because, like you said, we all kind of adapt and borrow good ideas. And if they make sense for us, we can implement our own version of it, and hopefully it helps.
I am in May of 2020, so 5-6 weeks after the world was shut down. I had a really smart colleague, a client at a wonderful institution, say to me, what are best practices during this time? I said, yeah, I think we're building. Like, I appreciate you wanting to look for the roadmap, but you're drawing it. So. There's no best practices for the last pandemic are not going to be that helpful to us right now in fundraising.
Yeah, I've been using the phrase prevailing practices because
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
we know what a lot of people are doing. We don't know if they're any good or not, but we know what they're doing. We'll find out though. We'll find
Yeah,
out.
exactly. Check back with me and Andy in 5 years to see what actually turned out to be best. So Andy, thank you so much for being here today. I want to thank you, thank the GGNA team that produces these webinars. Thanks to all of you for joining us again. Apologies for our technical glitches today. If you have questions, please do send those via the Q&A button or send them to us on our website, and Andy will help us with responses. I also invite you to connect to Andy, to me, and to the firm on LinkedIn. And if you have ideas, best practices or prevailing practices that you think are best from this period related to alumni engagement, please do share them with us on LinkedIn so others can see them as well. If you want to talk to GGNA about how we can help your institution impact issues like this we've talked about today, please do contact us via our website or LinkedIn. Again, thank you all for being with us today. We hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.